Hello everyone and welcome to Archaeoviking. As I'm sure most of us know, today is Columbus Day. And so being that today is Columbus Day, I have decided to take a look at the true story of Christopher Columbus, or Cristobal Colon, as the proper name is. Specifically, I want to look at the true story of the tyranny of Columbus, as the true story of Columbus is actually the story of the man who initiated the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So I'm sure most of us have an idea of who or what Columbus was, thanks to the American education system, where we learned things, at least I did, like the tune 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as well as the fact that Columbus sailed across the sea to prove to all the other academics and merchants that the world was actually round, because they all believed the world was flat, and that in doing so he discovered America. Discovered, which ignores, of course, the Scandinavian discovery of America and establishment of the colony of Lansomatos in Canada, and most importantly ignores the fact that there were hundreds of millions of people already here in the American continents and that had been living here for about 40,000 years, if not more. So, and of course, as I said in the title, the true story of Columbus is a lot darker than we hear. And I will definitely get into that. However, before we do this, we have to look at sort of the background of why Columbus wanted to go across the Atlantic. Okay, so it all goes back to the Mongol Empire, which rose in roughly 1200 to 1211 CE in Mongolia and spread like wildfire, conquering most of Eurasia until the 1260s and 70s, in which they stopped their conquests. However, despite their conquests ending, they reopened the Silk Road. And I say reopened because the Silk Road had been in existence during the time of the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty of China, which the Silk Road facilitated trade with both those empires, as well as during the time of the Byzantine Empire and the Tang Dynasty of China, again, which facilitated trade between those empires. However, with the fall of the Tang Dynasty, the overland route, not the maritime route, I'll get into the maritime route in a little bit, the overland route collapsed for about 300 years until the rise of the Mongol Empire. And so with the Mongol Empire's rise and the reopening of the Silk Road, a period of great cultural exchange, cultural development, technological development, and trade began to blossom. And so, as I said, this allowed for the opening of an overland trade route, as well as the continued use of the maritime trade route that you see here, as the maritime trade route had remained open even after the fall of the Tang Dynasty. And both of these routes allowed individuals such as merchants such as Marco Polo, who used both the overland and the maritime routes to get back and forth, to go back and forth to China and the Mongol Empire from 1271 CE to 1295 CE, as well as other merchants such as Ibn Battuta, who did everything Marco Polo did and more, considering he went down into Africa as well. And so these merchants, which included Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo, but did not exclude, but were not limited to these individuals, allowed for merchants like Marco Polo to bring back from China improved knowledge of astronomy, improved cartographic techniques, i.e., techniques that allowed the improvement of maps and navigation. Merchants brought back tales and ideas of printing presses, as well as they brought back improved medical documents, allowed medical knowledge to be exchanged, much of it coming from China and the Middle East, as well as bringing back improved compasses, as it's important to note compasses were already in use in one form or the other in Europe at this time, but these merchants brought new and improved ones, as well as they brought back improved knowledge of the lay of the land, both overland and also improved knowledge of the makeup of the islands and seas. Unfortunately, the Mongol Empire would eventually fall with the Ilkhanate, as the Mongol Empire was divided up into 4 Khanates, with 3 of them, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Chagatai Khanate, to varying degrees being subject to the rule of the Empire of the Red Khan here, began to fall. The Ilkhanate falling in 1350, the Empire of the Great Khan falling in 1368, the Golden Horde falling in 1404, and the Chagatai Khanate being actually the longest lasting, and actually eventually evolving into the Timurid Empire, which reconquered the Persian Ilkhanate, lasting until 1450. And it's important to note that the Timurid Empire and the Chagatai Khanate did keep the Silk Route open to some degree until the 1450s. However, the turmoil of the fall of these various parts of the Mongol Empire did cause upheaval in the trade between China and Europe. But again, the Timurid Empire, the Chagatai Khanate, was able to keep it open to some degree until the 1450s. And this upheaval was actually exacerbated by the fall of Constantinople in 1453 at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire being a Turkish successor state to the Mongol Empire. And in 1453, they conquered and overthrew the Byzantine Empire. And after doing this, they shut the door of the Silk Road to European merchants, for the most part. They did allow some through, but those merchants they allowed through were required to pay exorbitant fines. And so this led to a fairly long pause in trade between Europe and China. A pause that many European monarchs and politicians obviously wanted to alleviate and amend. One such figure, in fact, the most important figure to start this, trying to fix this, was Prince Henry of Portugal, also known as Prince Henry the Navigator. And he was called this because he took these improved cartographic and navigational techniques brought from China by merchants such as Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, and began to improve the Portuguese navy, training the next generation of Portuguese sailors in these new and improved navigational techniques, as well as funding expeditions by the Portuguese Navy down the west coast of Africa, eventually leading to the Portuguese discovery of areas like the Cape of Good Hope and the southernmost tip of Africa, therefore creating the Portuguese Maritime Empire. And it was during the rise of this Portuguese Maritime Empire that a young Genoan sailor, or at least we think he was Genoan, there's some debate about whether he was from Genoa or another Italian city-state, named Cristobal Colon, or Christopher Columbus, began to really get his feet wet in maritime expeditions. In fact, the thing that he made most of his money off of was the slave trade, because of course the Portuguese took advantage of political conflicts between the kingdoms in Africa, because despite common misconception, Africa at the time had several very sophisticated and powerful kingdoms of their own, the Mali Kingdom and the Mali Empire and the Songhai Empire, among others. And so, of course, during battles with their enemies, these kingdoms would take prisoners of war. And these kingdoms would then be paid exorbitant funds by the Portuguese to gain these prisoners of war, who would be then shipped up to Europe and used in slave labor. Also, Portugal would go out on expeditions of their own and capture their own prisoners, but generally they took advantage of the political, I don't want to say instability, because these nations were stable, but they took advantage of wars going on to essentially commodify human life, something that even those kingdoms before this didn't do. And Christopher Columbus loved this economy, and as I'll bring up later, he kept trying to replicate it in his governorship of the Americas. And so with this creation of the Portuguese Maritime Empire, as well as the improvement of the navigational and cartographic methods, many scholars and politicians in Europe began to re-entertain and bring up the idea of reopening the trade with China. One such individual was Paolo Toscanelli, who, using the descriptions of the geographical descriptions of China and the seas brought by these merchants such as Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, he created his own map I believe before 1474, but this is a copy of his map from 1474, and also began to talk about an idea of, we can sail across the Atlantic Ocean to get to China and completely circumvent the Ottoman Empire route. Now, before I get into Columbus, I also have to bring up that no one, at least for the most part, no one thought the world was flat. And in fact, going as far back as Eratosthenes in 300 BCE in Greece, most people in Europe, and then also due to trade and things like that in China and India and such, did not think the world was flat. In fact, there were globes. There was a globe in China from the 1200s, and then also maps like this showing the world to be a sphere. What most politicians like Paolo Toscanelli wanted to do was, they thought you could sail across the Atlantic. In fact, as you can see here, the Atlantic was viewed as a lot smaller, and the route was viewed as a lot smaller because the islands that are thought to be like China and Japan and such are right smack dab in the middle of North America. So there is that. And eventually Toscanelli would actually, he would try to reach he would try to convince a lot of monarchs to take upon this idea and this venture, but many of them refused. However, eventually, after an exchange of a couple of letters, Toscanelli did convince Columbus to do this. And so Columbus took it upon himself to continue Toscanelli's quest to go across the Atlantic, and he took his idea and began looking for patronage in the various monarchies of Europe. He first went to John II of Portugal, who refused, and then eventually he went to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And he showed them a variety of things. One of the things being a map that he drew based off of Toscanelli's map. Toscanelli had actually given him, or at least we think he gave him, a copy of the map he drew up, and basically told the king and queen of Spain, like, hey, we can do this. We can sail across and we can make a lot of money. And the monarchs, especially Isabella, decided, hey, you're right. This is a good idea. Or at least we'll entertain that this is a good idea, and they agreed to fund Christopher Columbus's voyage. His first voyage, in fact, in 1492, where he first landed on the island of Hispaniola, which is the island that now contains the two modern-day nations of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, as well as Cuba and the Bahamas. However, as I said at the beginning, well, he claimed to have discovered this place and claimed that he was in China. In fact, he claimed he was in China until the day he died. This area was already home to millions of people, including but not limited to the Taino people, the Bimini, as well as the Kalinaga people, also known as the Carib. And in fact, these people, despite living in what we might consider simple, straw huts, which actually weren't, they were rather sophisticated and well thought out objects, they had beautiful cultures. They had beautiful art that they developed, as well as the fact that these tribes had intricate trade networks, trading with tribes in Florida, Central America, and South America. So, with that in mind, what did Columbus think when he came across these people? Nothing good. So, we first got to look at so we have to look at how he described them in his accounts and his journals and such. First, in a letter he sent, one of the first letters he sent to the Queen of England. Sorry, that's the first letter. In his journal, he described them as he said that if they decided to that they should wish injure on those who have remained in the fortress, because of course he built a fortress, he was a military leader, they cannot do so, for they have no arms, i.e. weapons. They go naked and are cowardly, and a small group in the fortress could easily hold the whole island in check, which is another thing which is a common thing that he talks about, which will come up again in a minute. But he also tried to basically immediately he tries to immediately convince the King and Queen of England, specifically the Queen of England, of a very clear thing. He says, and I quote, "They should be good servants and intelligent, for I observed that they quickly took in what was said to them, and I believe that they would easily be made Christians, as it appeared to me that they had no religion. I, our Lord, being pleased, will take hence at the time of my departure 6 natives for your highness, that they may be able to speak. I saw no beasts of any kind except any parrots on the island, etc." So in essence, he's saying, we could turn them into slaves. They would be good slaves. I'm bringing you 6 to show you how good they would be slaves. so yeah. That's pretty clear on itself. And of course, you can pause to read these documents. This is from Christopher Columbus's letter in 1493 to the Queen, and then this is an account from his journal of his first voyage. He also goes on to state in that letter to the Queen, see here, it might be converted into an island in 2 days. Here we go. For these people are very simple as regards to the use of arms. As your highnesses will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken to bring home and learn our language and return. Unless your highness should order them all brought to Castile, or to be kept as captives on the same island. For with only 50 men, they can all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. So here we have it. He's talking about twice how a small group of men could conquer the island. With his first account talking about how his men could hold the island for a short amount of time in a fort, because the Taino and the Kalinaga and other tribes are cowardly, and he describes them as beasts. In fact, they can't read, which, whatever, they had their own writing. Just because their writing wasn't like what we see here doesn't mean anything. And he talks about the second thing he talks about is he can conquer the entire island and subjugate and enslave them with only 50 men. And then he talks about how he's bringing 6 with him to prove to the King and Queen of Spain, 6 Taino people, Taino people, 6 native people to Spain, to prove to the King and Queen of Spain how great of slaves and servants these people would be. And then eventually he, like he said, he took these 6 individuals, these 6 prisoners, with him back to Spain, and basically asked the King and Queen of Spain for more money, which they accepted. They gave him a royal proclamation to come back to this area, to the Caribbean, with a second voyage encompassing much more than Hispaniola and Cuba, but also Jamaica and various other places, with the order to convert and conquer these people and to convert them all to Christianity. And in fact, it's during this time that Columbus actually creates the transatlantic slave trade, the triangular trade. For those of you who need a refresher, the transatlantic slave trade was essentially, or the triangular trade was essentially raw materials being shipped from the Americas by European powers to Europe to make manufactured goods, which would then be shipped from Europe to pay the various African kingdoms for prisoners of war who would be enslaved. And you might ask, I'm sure you're asking, Dane, how did he create the transatlantic slave trade? There were no African slaves being used during this time. These were not Africans in the Americas. Well, you're right, and that's because the transatlantic slave trade was actually started with indigenous slavery, where he talks about in his second voyage things like we send by these two vessels some of these cannibal men and women, as well as some children, and both male and female, as well as saying that let's see here. Here we go. As well as saying that that by degrees more care be bestowed upon them than would be given to other slaves, in order that afterwards one may learn from one another. Saying that they would be good workers and employed in useful occupations. That's pretty clear in itself what he's talking about. So this is what I mean by he created the transatlantic slave trade, because he began shipping these poor individuals, these indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Taino, the Kalinaga, etc., across to be enslaved by the European powers. Columbus also, as we're about to see here, also openly talks about how cruel he is to these people. Talking about see here we go. When they see the good treatment that we shall shew them those who do well, and the punishment that we shall inflict on those who do wrong, we will hasten to submit, and their highness will be shortly able to reckon them among the number of subjects. So he's basically saying, we're gonna brutally punish them if they don't do what we say, but we'll reward them if they do what we want. And then he also goes on to talk about how you talk about cattle being there, and basically says the people might be sold at a moderate price for the cattle might be sold at a moderate price for the account of the bearers, and the latter, i.e., the owners of the cattle, might be paid with slaves taken from the Caribs, who are wild people fit for any work, well proportioned and very intelligent. So there we have it. We're talking about, he talks about the brutal treatment that he inflicts upon these people if they don't do what he wants. And then he talks about paying his men, the cattle bearers, whom he's asking. Essentially, he's in this letter from the second voyage, January 30th, 1494. He's asking her for more colonists, essentially, and he's saying, we'll pay them in slaves taken from the Caribs, the Kalinaga people. In fact, Columbus even goes on to talk about these people that he took from the Carib, and he's saying they have gotten rid of their cruel habits to which they have become accustomed, and will be better than any kind of slaves. So what this is evidence of is essentially like I said earlier in the video, Columbus really got his feet wet in the maritime trade in the Portuguese slave trade of Africa. In fact, he goes on to say things like, "Their Highness might fix duties on the slaves that may be taken over upon the arrival in Spain." So here again we have the continued mention to these monarchs of how he wants to start the slave trade based off of these individuals, saying, "We can take them. I'm sending them already over to you. I'm going to pay the colonists in the amount of slaves we take from tribes like the Kalinaga, the Carib." And in fact, I think that the Queen could, fix duties upon them once they arrive, and that they will be better than any other kind of slave we've ever encountered in the Portuguese slave trade. Doesn't exactly sound like a brave explorer sailing across the Atlantic to prove the world is round. But it doesn't stop there. In fact, some of the other acts that Columbus did were even more heinous. So this is a trigger warning, because this is going to describe a very, very dark and alarming episode of sexual assault. However, it's important to bring up because it is one of the things that Columbus did to reward his men. And so this comes to us from the a letter by one of Christopher Columbus's childhood friends, Michele de Quino. And in his letter, he talks about how, and I'm just going to paraphrase, how as a reward, Columbus gave Quino a beautiful cannibal girl that the admiral gave her. So he says, "When I was in the boat, I took a beautiful cannibal girl, and the admiral gave her to me." Now here's where the trigger warning comes into context. "Having her in my room, and she being naked, as is their customs, I began to want to amuse myself with her. Since I wanted to have my way with her, and she was not willing, she worked me over so badly with her nails that I wish to have never begun. To get to the end of the story, seeing how things were going, I got a rope and tied her up so tightly that she made unheard cries, which you wouldn't have believed." Yeah, and I'm not going to continue that. All I can say is essentially this is incredibly fucked up, and this is some of the things that Columbus did to reward his men. Again, this was not a man going across the sea to prove the world was round. This was a man going across the sea to conquer peoples and to use them to enslave them and use them for slave labor. Yeah, maybe his first expedition was to open up trade with China, but it very quickly became a essentially, it became a conquest. It very quickly became a mission of conquest and subjugation, and a mission to create and profit off of the slave trade. In fact, Michele de Quino continues talking about how he, at one point in time, took across 1,600 indigenous individuals, 600 men, etc., etc., only for the route to become so treacherous that by the time they got back, 200 of them had died. So, yeah, not only were they taking thousands of enslaved indigenous peoples to enslave them, they were already, in a very similar way to how enslaved Africans would face on the route to the Americas, were already dying in the long, treacherous route back to Europe. Eventually, Columbus would return to Europe, Spain specifically, in 1496, before eventually being promoted to the governor of this new realm that he found, and being given the task of confirming rumors that there was a continent to the south and west of Hispaniola, by a rumor that had been brought up by various kings, such as the King John II of Portugal. And so Columbus did this. He sailed back to the Americas and established the colony of Hispaniola. And with the establishment of this colony of Hispaniola, Columbus implemented a slave system known as the encomienda. Now, the encomienda had been in existence before Columbus established it in Hispaniola. It had been in existence in Spain. However, it was different than the American encomienda. The encomienda in Spain was essentially a form of fiefdom, like a feudal state. The encomienda that Columbus established in Hispaniola in the Americas was nothing less short of slavery. In fact, it was slavery. It was built completely on the forced labor of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, who were used and forced to work in areas like mines and crops and plantations. And in fact, many individuals continue, other than Columbus, mention this house. These individuals were enslaved, as individuals such as Bartholomew De Los Casas mentions in both his History of the Indies and his short account of the destruction of the Indies. Talks about how those taken alive in battle and raids become slaves, as that is the principal crop of the admiral, with which he expected to cover the expenses that the monarchs exacted for supporting the Spanish in the islands to the advantage of the monarchs, as well as in order to tempt merchants and people to live there without expecting a salary from the monarchs and without any necessity of giving one. Need I bring up that excerpt where he was telling the king and queen, say, hey, we can pay these plantation owners and these colonists with slaves. So we got to talk about Bartholomew De Los Casas that I just mentioned here. So Bartholomew De Los Casas was actually one of the several lieutenants of Columbus. And he was, for the most part, had his nose right up the ass of Columbus. He was a brown-noser is an understatement. He talked about Columbus being sent from God, the glorious Columbus. However, he was also not for the brutality of Columbus or his or the enslavement of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In fact, he talks about it as such in his short account of the destruction of the Indies. Again, trigger warning about content involving sexual assault and the murder of children. Okay, so first on page 4 of his brief account of the destruction of the Indies, see here, Bartolomé de las Casas says that when the Spanish first arrived here, about 500,000 men dwelt in the island. They are now cut off, some by slaughter, others ravished away by force and violence, took to work into the mines of Hispaniola, which was destitute of native inhabitants, for a captain vessel sailing to the isle to the end, and that the harvest being over, some good Christian moved with piety and pity undertook this dangerous voyage to convert the souls of Christianity. Again, there's the nose right squarely up the ass of Christopher Columbus. And he talks about the remaining gleanings of the islands might be gathered up here. He also talks about some of the brutality that was placed upon them by Columbus and his generals and his lieutenants. And this is also, he goes on to say, and this also is a really true as the precedent narration, which the very tyrants and cruel murderers cannot deny without the stigma of lie, that the Spaniards never received any injury from the Indians, but that they rather revered them as persons descended from heaven, until they were compelled to take up arms, provoked thereunto by repeated injuries, violent torments, and unjust butcheries. He goes on to say, in the Isle, which, as we have said, the Spaniards first attempted, the bloody slaughter and destruction of men first began, for they violently forced away women and children to make them slaves, and ill-treated them, consuming and wasting their food, which they had purchased with great sweat, toil, and yet remained dissatisfied too, which everyone according to his strength and ability, and that was very inconsiderable, for they provided no other food other than what was absolutely necessary without superfluity. While one individual Spaniard, i.e. Spaniards in general, consumed more food, victuals, in one day than would serve and maintain 3 families a month, with every one of those families consisting of 10 people. So there's that. Talking about how once they enslave them, they give them very little food, and they impress upon them very harsh, brutal injustices and punishments, which is the only reason they rose up to begin with, which the indigenous peoples rose up against the Spaniards to begin with, which I don't necessarily believe, but still, I believe they did it a lot more than that. But there you have it. And they also go on to talk about how they snatched young babies from their mother's breasts and then dashed them out, the brains of the innocents, against the rocks. This is where that trigger warning comes in, people. Others they cast into rivers, scoffing and jeering them, and called upon their bodies, when falling with derision, the true testimony of their cruelty to come to them, and inhumanely exposing others to their merciless swords, together with the mothers that gave them their life. He also talks about how the men bred such fierce hunting dogs as would devour an Indian like a hog at first sight in less than a moment. Now such kind of slaughter and cruelties as these were committed by the curs, and if that at any time it happened, which was rarely, that the Indians, irritated upon a just account, destroyed or took away a life of any Spaniard, they promulgated and proclaimed this law among them, that 100 Indians should die for every individual Spaniard that should be slain. So, looking at this, we get an account of basically anyone in any raids being, basically any survivors of any raids or battle being taken into slavery, being given very little food, and then if they even attempt to rise up and fight back, they suffer harsh punishments, and they have dogs, harsh dogs set upon them to attack them, and that with every one Spaniard is worth the lives of 100 Indians, 100 indigenous peoples. So we get an account of the brutal slavery that Columbus was implementing in the Americas, but also we get another picture, because often one of the sort of counter arguments to this idea that Columbus was a horrible person was like, well, he was a man of his time. All the other men would have done it, which is like, yeah, all his men would have done it. But what this account talks about is it shows that there were actually people like Bartholomew De Los Casas who were against this type of behavior, who thought that the enslavement and harsh treatment of these peoples, of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Taino, the Kalinaga, among others, was wrong and immoral. So this shows that even by the standards of Columbus's own time, Columbus was horrible. Now, and it can be brought up that Bartolome de las Casas still had his nose shoved up Columbus's ass. He thought he was the greatest thing ever. But even despite thinking Columbus was the greatest thing ever, he thought this treatment was horrible. And so this eventually led to the investigation of Francisco de Bobadilla, who was sent by Spain to investigate claims of misconduct and tyranny. And in his investigation, essentially, what led to this investigation, before I get into what he found, was one, the accounts of Bartholomew De Los Casas, but also the accounts of his tyranny and his mistreatment, not just the indigenous peoples, but also to his own men. And so once Francisco de Bobadilla came to Hispaniola, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, he heard accounts of, essentially, what he heard was like, one man was caught stealing corn and had his nose and ears cut off. He was placed in shackles and then auctioned off as a slave. A woman who dared to suggest Columbus was of lowly birth was punished by his brother Bartolome, who had also traveled to the Caribbean. She was stripped naked and paraded around the colony on the back of a mule. And this source comes from Bobadilla's own accounts, which unfortunately is not available online. However, the source that you see here cites it, and it is cited in books such as The Other Slavery, which I will cite in the sources. And so this, and among other accounts, as well as Bartolome de los Casas accounts, eventually led to Columbus having to flee, having to go back to Spain in order to argue his case. And while there, first he said, this is in a letter to the nurse of the royal family. He says, for the calumny, or the group, or the mob, i.e. like the mob rule kind of thing, has done me more injury than the services which I have rendered to their highnesses and the care which I have preserved their property and their government have done me good. And it said, it's like, if their highness, he also says, if their highnesses would consent to the silence the popular rumors which have gained credence among those who know what fatigues I have sustained, it would be a real charity. And then he goes on to talk about how great and prosperous his colony was, among other things. Specifically, he goes on to talk about now that so much gold is found, let me go from the beginning to get the full context. How about that? But now I find myself shipwrecked until now. I have maintained the justice and augmented the territorial dominions of their highness. Now that so much gold is found, these people stop to consider whether they can obtain the greatest quantity of it by theft or by going to the mines. For one woman they give 100 castellanos, as for a farm. For this sort of trading is very common, and there are already a great number of merchants who go in search of girls. There are at this moment in time, from 9 to 10 on sale, and they fetch a good price, let their age be what it will. So he's saying, in his defense against these claims, I am being hurt by this rumors, by this mob rule, and it's unjust that I am being hurt by these claims when I have brought you so much wealth, including young girls, which I sell for. He gives a raw amount, a raw monetary amount for girls. So he states that one of the commodities of this trade is young girls that he takes, and that's why the king and queen should forgive him of his transgressions and should ignore what these people are saying. So eventually he would be acquitted of his crimes. However, due to these accounts, he was replaced by an individual known as Nicolás de Ovando, who replaced him as the governor of Hispaniola. Columbus, however, would get another chance to explore in 1502. To be clear, he returned to Spain in 1500. That's where that letter comes from. And then he would be allowed to return in 1502 to explore the area, specifically to try and find a passage to China again. However, he would describe, you can pause the read, I'm not going to read these as much, how once he left, a huge tempest, a huge storm, destroyed many of his ships, and eventually he would be shipwrecked and have to make his way through canoes to various islands, including Jamaica. And in fact, on Jamaica, he and his group were almost ambushed and killed by the indigenous peoples living on Jamaica, only for him to use his astronomical knowledge to predict an eclipse and prevent them from killing him. I necessarily don't believe this. I think this is just him trying to explain how he survived, but that's his account. Supposedly, he convinced the indigenous peoples not to kill him by using a lunar eclipse. And eventually, with the failure of this expedition, he would return to Spain. But the damage had already been done. For one thing, the Spanish Empire, specifically the Spanish Empire in the Americas, because the Spanish Empire in Africa and in Asia is attributed to Vasco da Gama's explorations, but the Spanish Empire in America was already in full swing of being created. Furthermore, the effects of Christopher Columbus's governorship had almost all but wiped out the population of the Taino and the other indigenous tribes, such as the Kalinaga. As you can see here, in 1492, the population of the Tainos on the island of Hispaniola alone was almost 8 million. And then by 1496, during Columbus's voyage, the second voyage, it's down to almost 4 million. And then by 1500, when he's going back to Spain, it's down to only 500,000. And then by 1507, of course, this isn't in Columbus's time as a governor, but still, it's down to 60,000, and then it keeps going, which really is a testament to how brutal Columbus's governorship was. Now, one could argue, oh, well, maybe it was the smallpox that they brought. Actually, studies have shown, recent studies have shown that smallpox didn't show up in the Caribbean until around 1518, 18 years after Columbus was removed as governor. However, because of the decimation of the Taino and the other indigenous peoples of the Americas, as well as the brutal treatment of these indigenous peoples by Columbus and his successors, including de Ovando, the Spanish crown eventually created the laws of the Burgos. And this law of Burgos actually outlawed the mistreatment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Now, it is important to note that this law was largely ignored by many, if not all, Spanish governors, but the fact that the king and queen even passed it at all, like the accounts of Bartholomew De Los Casas, shows that the treatment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas was, even by the standards of the time, considered immoral. But as I said, it would be largely ignored. In fact, you can see that in the 1550s, the encomiendas were still rather prosperous, with most encomiendas being in areas like Mexico and Peru, producing millions of amounts of gold and silver being shipped to Spain. And even after the establishment of the laws of Burgos, while there was some decline of encomiendas in areas like Mexico, other areas like Peru and Nicaragua, and Chile, and Tucumán did not decline, or at least they did not decline until much later. So yeah, and even then, you know, a minus 10 decline, 10% decline, uh, considering how many encomiendas were in central Mexico, is not that much. In fact, there were many encomiendas that were under the control of the crown itself. In this graph, you can see right here, represented by T, number of towns under crown control, and number in E representing number of encomiendas under crown control. So even though they passed this law to stop the mistreatment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, they participated in it as well. So yes, but again, yes, they participated in it, but it's also important to note it was still considered immoral at the time. And here's just a graph showing Mexico, as you saw, which was had the largest number of encomiendas. This is just showing the sheer amount of encomiendas that were open, whether they be, you know, in Tenochtitlan or in some cases, like in Tacuba, being perpetually open. That being said, the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas being said, we should also note that while it was a brutal genocide, these people were not wiped out. In fact, the Taino and the Kalinaga both still exist, with the Kalinaga existing in the so-called Carib district in the Dominican Republic, and the Taino being divided up various islands in the Caribbean. And they, in fact, to this day, they have beautiful cultures, beautifully complex cultures, and they continue to fight for recognition from many colonial governments. So I think it's important to end this video with saying, hey, European powers under Columbus came and committed a genocide on these people. Go out and learn. It's the least we can do is go out and learn about their cultures. Not steal, don't know cultural appropriation, but, you know, go out and learn about their cultures, as also as well as to advocate for them, like help them gain recognition, help them get their land back in one form or the other, because it's important. Because again, Columbus started a genocide in the Americas, and despite even though the crown and others participated in it, it was still considered amoral at the time by everyone else who wasn't in Columbus's inner circle. So, all right, so that ends the video. Did you learn about any of this in history, your history classes, or anything like that? Do you want to see me cover the Taino or the Kalinaga or other cultures in greater detail? If so, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section, and I hope you, I hope this video informed you, and I hope you took the video as a sign to go out and learn the actual history of things, as well as took this video as a sign to go out and learn about the real history of the Taino and the Kalinaga people. And with that, I'm going to end the video, and I hope you all have a good day.